In the heart of London, where ancient traditions meet modern royalty, a single moment of extraordinary courage would forever change how the world sees the unwavering dedication of the Queen's Guard. What began as a routine morning at Buckingham Palace would become a testament to human resilience, royal compassion, and the unbreakable bonds that tie duty to honor. On a crisp autumn morning in October 2023, as tourists gathered behind the iconic black railings and cameras clicked in anticipation of the changing of the guard ceremony, no one could have predicted that they were about to witness something far more profound than pageantry. They would see a display of dedication so pure, so unwavering, that it would leave even the youngest members of the royal family moved to tears. This is the story of Guardsman James Mitchell, a 24-year-old soldier from Yorkshire whose commitment to his post would be tested in ways no training manual could prepare him for. It's the story of Princess Charlotte and Prince George, whose innocent hearts would be touched by witnessing true sacrifice. And it's the story of how sometimes the most powerful lessons about duty, honor, and compassion come not from books or speeches, but from watching someone choose to stand when everything tells them to fall. What happened that morning would ripple through the halls of Buckingham Palace, reach the highest levels of the royal family, and remind a watching world that behind the red tunics and bearskin hats stand real people with real courage, facing real challenges with extraordinary grace. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time before taking his position. At 24 years old, James carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 2 years of service in the Grenadier Guards, but today felt different somehow. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves from St. James's Park, and the usual bustle of early morning tourists was beginning to gather behind the ornate iron railings. James had been assigned to post number 7, the position directly in front of the palace's main entrance, where the morning light would catch the gold buttons of his uniform, and where hundreds of photographs would be taken throughout his 2-hour duty shift. His bearskin hat, weighing nearly 2 pounds, sat perfectly positioned on his head, and his rifle rested precisely against his right shoulder. Everything was exactly as it should be, following traditions that stretched back centuries. The young guardsman came from a small village in Yorkshire, where his father worked as a mechanic and his mother taught at the local primary school. Growing up, James had always been fascinated by stories of the military, but it was the pageantry and history of the Queen's Guard that truly captured his imagination. When he was 8 years old, his family had taken their first and only trip to London, and young James had stood mesmerized watching the guards at their posts, silent and unmoving like living statues. One day, "I'm going to stand there," he had whispered to his mother, tugging at her coat sleeve with small, excited fingers. She had smiled down at him, not knowing that 15 years later, her son would indeed fulfill that childhood dream. The training to become a Queen's Guard had been rigorous beyond anything James had imagined. Months of physical conditioning, weapons training, and ceremonial drill had pushed him to his limits and beyond. But perhaps the most challenging aspect was learning the art of remaining absolutely motionless for hours at a time. The guards were not merely soldiers. They were living symbols of British tradition and military excellence, expected to maintain their positions regardless of weather, distractions, or personal discomfort. During his training, James had learned about the legendary endurance of guards who had stood their posts through thunderstorms, snow, and scorching heat. There were stories passed down through generations of guardsmen who had remained at attention while protesters shouted in their faces, while birds perched on their hats, and even while medical emergencies unfolded nearby. The motto was simple but absolute: the post comes first, always. As James took his position that October morning, he noticed the growing crowd of spectators. Families with young children pressed against the railings, cameras and phones held high to capture the iconic image of the British Guard. Street performers nearby added to the festive atmosphere, and the sweet smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart drifted across the courtyard. Among the crowd, though James couldn't see them yet, were some very special visitors. The Prince and Princess of Wales had decided to bring their children, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, for an impromptu educational visit to see the changing of the guard ceremony. It was part of their ongoing effort to help their children understand the traditions and responsibilities that would one day be part of their own lives. 10-year-old Prince George, dressed in a navy blue coat and looking every inch the future king, held his father's hand as they approached the palace. His curiosity about military traditions had been growing, especially since learning about the role the guards played in protecting the royal family. 8-year-old Princess Charlotte, wearing a purple coat that matched her bright, intelligent eyes, skipped alongside her mother, asking a stream of questions about why the guards wore such tall hats and how long they had to stand still. The guards are very special soldiers. Their mother, the Princess of Wales, explained as they found a good viewing position near the front of the crowd. They've trained for many years to be here, and their job is very important. They protect not just the palace, but everything it represents about our history and traditions. Prince George studied the nearest guard intently. "Do they ever get tired, Mama?" he asked, his young voice filled with wonder. "I'm sure they do," his mother replied gently. "But they've learned to put their duty before their own comfort. It's something we can all learn from." As the morning progressed, James felt the familiar rhythm of his duty settling over him. The weight of his equipment, the sounds of the city around him, the whispered conversations of tourists, all of it became background noise as he focused on maintaining perfect posture and vigilance. His training had taught him to be aware of everything while appearing to notice nothing, to be a guardian who was both highly visible and mysteriously distant. The first hour passed smoothly. James's body had adapted to the demands of standing perfectly still. His breathing was steady and controlled, and his mind remained alert despite the repetitive nature of his surroundings. Occasionally, tourists would try to get his attention, waving hands in front of his face or making funny poses beside him for photographs, but James's expression remained unchanged. This was all part of the job, part of the mystique that made the Queen's Guard so fascinating to visitors from around the world. It was during the second hour that James first felt something was wrong. A sharp pain shot through his left ankle, sudden and intense enough to make him want to shift his weight. He'd twisted it slightly during morning PT the day before, but it had seemed fine during the walk to his post. Now, however, the pain was becoming more pronounced with each passing minute. James fought to maintain his composure, drawing on his training to push the discomfort to the back of his mind. Pain was temporary, duty was eternal. That was what his drill sergeant had hammered into every recruit. The young guardsman concentrated on his breathing, using techniques he'd learned to manage physical stress while maintaining his ceremonial bearing. But the pain was getting worse. What had started as a sharp twinge was now a constant, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. James could feel sweat beginning to form under his bearskin hat despite the cool morning air. He tried to adjust his stance microscopically, hoping to relieve some of the pressure on his injured ankle, but any movement significant enough to help would be visible to the watching crowd and, worse, to his superiors. In the crowd, Princess Charlotte had been watching James's post with particular interest. Children, with their natural empathy and keen observation skills, often notice things that adults miss. She tugged on her mother's sleeve, her small face creased with concern. "Mama, I think something's wrong with that guard," she whispered, pointing discreetly toward James. The Princess of Wales followed her daughter's gaze, studying the guardsman carefully. To an untrained eye, he appeared exactly as he should, rigid, alert, and perfectly positioned. But Charlotte's intuition was picking up on subtle signs that something wasn't quite right. "What makes you think that, darling?" her mother asked quietly. "I don't know," Charlotte replied, her voice filled with the certainty that children sometimes possess. "He just looks different, like he's hurting." Meanwhile, Prince George had been observing the guards with the analytical mind that would one day serve him well as king. He'd been watching the way they breathed, the way they held their rifles, the way their eyes moved to track potential threats while never breaking their ceremonial stance. When Charlotte pointed out her concerns, George looked more carefully at James and began to see what his sister had noticed. "She's right," George said quietly to his father. "Something is different about him." The Prince of Wales, trained in both military protocol and human observation through his own service and royal duties, took a closer look at the guardsman his children had identified. At first, he saw nothing amiss, but as he continued to watch, he began to notice the almost imperceptible signs of distress that James was fighting so hard to conceal. As the morning wore on, James's condition continued to deteriorate. What he had initially assumed was a minor strain was revealing itself to be something more serious. The pain in his ankle had intensified to the point where it took every ounce of his mental strength to remain upright, and he was beginning to suspect that he might have a stress fracture or torn ligament. The irony wasn't lost on James that he was experiencing this crisis in front of one of the largest crowds he'd ever encountered. Hundreds of people were taking his photograph, many of them likely posting images to social media in real time. Any sign of weakness, any break in his composure, would be captured and shared around the world within minutes. But more than his own reputation was at stake. James understood that he represented something larger than himself. Every person in that crowd, every child taking their first glimpse of the famous Queen's Guard, was seeing in him a symbol of British military tradition and excellence. To falter now would not just be a personal failure. It would be a betrayal of centuries of tradition and the trust placed in him by his regiment and his country. The thought of his fellow guardsmen also weighed heavily on James's mind. He knew that they were watching, that his actions would reflect on them all. In the tight-knit community of the Guards' regiments, reputation was everything, and letting down his brothers in arms was unthinkable. As James struggled with his growing physical distress, he could not have known that his display of determination was already beginning to create ripples that would extend far beyond his 2-hour posting. The royal children continued to watch him with growing concern and admiration, their young minds beginning to understand what true dedication looked like when tested under pressure. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the palace courtyard, and James Mitchell continued to stand at his post, each minute becoming a testament to the power of duty over discomfort, of commitment over convenience. What had begun as a routine ceremonial posting was evolving into something much more significant, a demonstration of human courage and determination that would soon capture the attention and respect of people far more influential than he could have imagined. The stage was set for an extraordinary display of perseverance that would transform a simple guard duty into a powerful lesson about honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service. By the time the palace clock struck 10, James Mitchell's world had narrowed to a single, consuming focus, remaining upright. The pain in his left ankle had evolved from a sharp twinge to what felt like molten metal coursing through his leg with each heartbeat. Sweat now ran freely down his back beneath the heavy red wool of his tunic, and his hands, gripping his rifle, had begun to tremble almost imperceptibly. The crowd around him had grown larger as the morning progressed. Tour groups arrived in waves, their guides pointing out various aspects of the palace architecture and the significance of the guard's presence. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings, wide-eyed with wonder at these living statues in their magnificent uniforms. Street musicians had set up nearby, adding a festive atmosphere to what was already a bustling scene. James could hear fragments of conversation from the spectators, a constant murmur of different languages and accents as visitors from around the world gathered to witness this quintessentially British tradition. Cameras clicked continuously, and he knew that his image was being captured thousands of times, shared instantly across social media platforms, becoming part of countless vacation albums and travel blogs. "Look at how still he stands," an American tourist marveled to her companion. "How do they do it?" "Years of training," came the reply from what sounded like a British military veteran. "These lads are the best of the best. Takes incredible discipline to maintain that kind of bearing." If only they knew, James thought grimly, fighting another wave of pain that threatened to buckle his knees. His injury was definitely worsening, and he was beginning to suspect that continuing to bear weight on his ankle might be causing additional damage. But the alternative, breaking protocol and abandoning his post, was simply unthinkable. In his peripheral vision, James had been aware of a small group that seemed different from the typical tourists. They had arrived with a discreet security presence and maintained a respectful distance from the railings. But something about their bearing suggested they were more than casual visitors. He couldn't turn his head to look directly, but his training had taught him to be aware of everything happening in his vicinity. Princess Charlotte had not taken her eyes off James for the past 20 minutes. Her 8-year-old intuition was picking up on subtle changes in his posture and demeanor that were invisible to most adults. She noticed how he seemed to be favoring his right leg slightly, how his breathing had become more shallow and controlled, how the almost imperceptible tremor in his hands was becoming more pronounced. "Mama," Charlotte whispered urgently, tugging on her mother's sleeve again. "Something is really wrong with that guard. I think he's hurt." The Princess of Wales knelt down to Charlotte's level, following her daughter's concerned gaze toward James. "What makes you so sure, sweetheart? Watch how he's standing," Charlotte said with the earnest intensity that only children possess. "He's trying not to put weight on his left foot. And look at his hands, they're shaking a little bit." Prince George, who had been listening to his sister's observations, moved closer to the railings for a better view. At 10 years old, He was already showing signs of the analytical mind that would one day make him a thoughtful leader. Charlotte's right, he said quietly. I've been watching all the guards today, and he's definitely different. He looks like he's in pain. The Prince of Wales joined his family's scrutiny of James, his own military experience helping him recognize the signs his children had spotted. Years of service in the RAF had taught him to read body language and detect stress in soldiers under pressure. As he observed James more carefully, he began to see what his children had noticed, the subtle indicators of someone fighting through significant physical distress. You're both very observant, he told his children quietly. That guardsman is indeed struggling with something. But look at how he continues to do his duty despite his discomfort. That's what real courage looks like. As if summoned by some sixth sense, Sergeant Major Thompson appeared from within the palace grounds, making his routine inspection of the guard posts. A 20-year veteran of the Grenadier Guards, Thompson had an eagle eye for spotting problems before they became crises. He approached James's position with a measured pace that spoke of absolute authority and experience. James saw the sergeant major approaching and fought to present an even more perfect military bearing, despite the waves of pain radiating from his ankle. He knew that Thompson missed nothing, and the last thing he wanted was to be relieved of his post due to injury. The shame of abandoning his duty would be unbearable, both personally and professionally. Everything all right, Mitchell? Thompson asked quietly, positioning himself so that his conversation with James wouldn't be overheard by the spectators. Yes, Sergeant Major, James replied through gritted teeth, his voice steady despite the effort it took to maintain his composure. Thompson studied James carefully. He had seen countless young soldiers attempt to push through injuries during ceremonial duties, and he recognized the signs. The slight pallor of James's face, the tension in his jaw, the way he was distributing his weight, all pointed to someone in considerable distress. Your ankle? Thompson asked, his voice low but understanding. James hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. Minor discomfort, Sergeant Major. Nothing that interferes with duty. Thompson nodded slowly. He understood the young man's dedication, had felt the same fierce loyalty to duty during his own early years in the regiment. But he also understood the potential consequences of allowing an injured soldier to continue standing post. I can arrange for relief if needed, Mitchell, Thompson offered quietly. No shame in acknowledging injury. With respect, Sergeant Major, I can complete my posting, James replied, his voice carrying a quiet determination that impressed even the veteran Sergeant Major. Thompson studied James for another long moment, weighing the competing demands of soldier welfare and military tradition. Finally, he nodded. Very well. But I'll be checking on you regularly. If your condition worsens, you will accept relief. That's an order. Understood, Sergeant Major. As Thompson moved on to inspect the other posts, James felt a complex mix of relief and apprehension. He had been given permission to continue, but he also knew that he was now under closer scrutiny. Any sign of deterioration would result in his immediate removal from post, something that felt like failure despite the rational knowledge that injury was not a character flaw. The royal children had watched this interaction with growing fascination. They couldn't hear the conversation, but they could read the body language and understood that the situation was significant. Did you see that? Prince George asked his father. The other soldier talked to him, but he's still staying at his post. He must really want to finish his duty, Charlotte observed with the clear moral compass that children often possess. Even though he's hurting. The Princess of Wales was struck by her children's natural empathy and their ability to recognize courage when they saw it. This unplanned lesson in duty and perseverance was proving more educational than any formal instruction could have been. This is what dedication looks like, she explained to her children. That guardsman has made a promise to do his job, and he's keeping that promise even when it's difficult. That's the kind of commitment we should all try to have in our own responsibilities. As the morning progressed toward the 11 o'clock changing of the guard ceremony, James's condition continued to deteriorate. The pain in his ankle had become a constant, throbbing agony that required all of his mental strength to endure. He could feel his leg beginning to swell within his boot, and he suspected that he might have suffered a significant injury during his morning workout the previous day. The irony of the situation was not lost on James. Here he was, surrounded by hundreds of people who saw him as a symbol of strength and tradition, while inside, he was fighting the most difficult battle of his military career. Every minute that passed was a victory of will over weakness, of duty over personal comfort. The crowd had continued to grow as the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Tour guides began gathering their groups, photographers positioned themselves for the best shots, and children who had been playing nearby were called to attention by their parents. The atmosphere was building toward the pageantry and precision that made this one of London's most popular tourist attractions. Among the spectators, word had begun to spread about the guardsmen who seemed to be struggling. The royal family's focused attention on James had not gone unnoticed by other observers, and soon a subtle buzz of interest was rippling through the crowd. People began to watch James more carefully, noting the signs of distress that the royal children had first spotted. "Is he all right?" a concerned grandmother asked her son, pointing toward James with worry in her voice. "I think he might be injured," came the reply. "But look at him. He's not giving up." Social media began to reflect this growing awareness. Posts started appearing with captions like, "This guard seems to be pushing through pain," and "Real dedication on display at Buckingham Palace." What had begun as routine tourist photography was evolving into documentation of an extraordinary display of perseverance. James remained unaware of the growing attention focused on him. His world had contracted to the immediate challenge of remaining upright and maintaining his military bearing. Each breath was carefully controlled, each muscle held in precise position despite the waves of pain washing over him. The palace clock approached the half-hour mark, signaling that James was now well into the most challenging period of his posting. Normally, the second hour was when guards hit their stride, their bodies fully adapted to the demands of ceremonial duty. For James, however, each passing minute brought new challenges as his injury continued to affect his ability to maintain perfect military posture. As he fought through another wave of particularly intense pain, James caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. The royal family was repositioning themselves, moving to a location where they would have an even clearer view of his post. He wondered briefly why they seemed so interested in his particular position, but he couldn't spare the mental energy to ponder the question deeply. What James didn't realize was that his display of determination had captured the imagination and respect of some very important observers, and that his actions over the next hour would create ripples extending far beyond the palace gates. The stage was set for a confrontation between human limitation and unwavering dedication, witnessed by those who understood better than most the true cost of duty and service. The palace clock chimed 11 times, its ancient bronze voice echoing across the courtyard as hundreds of spectators pressed closer to the railings in anticipation of the changing of the guard ceremony. For James Mitchell, each chime felt like both a countdown to relief and a reminder of how much longer he had to endure. His 2-hour posting was approaching its final phase, but the last 30 minutes would prove to be the most challenging of his military career. The pain in James's ankle had reached a level that he had never experienced before. What had begun as a manageable discomfort had evolved into something that required every ounce of his mental and physical training to overcome. His left leg was now bearing almost no weight, a fact he was desperately trying to conceal through micro-adjustments in his posture that would be invisible to casual observers, but were costing him tremendous effort to maintain. Sweat had soaked through his red tunic despite the cool October air, and James could feel rivulets running down his spine beneath the heavy wool uniform. His breathing had become shallow and controlled, each inhalation a conscious effort to maintain the steady rhythm expected of a Queen's Guard. The bearskin hat, normally a source of pride, now felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and keeping his head perfectly level required constant concentration. In the crowd, Princess Charlotte had become James's most dedicated observer. Her 8-year-old heart was filled with a mixture of admiration and concern as she watched this soldier push through obvious pain to maintain his duty. She had noticed how his right leg was now bearing almost all of his weight, how his knuckles had turned white as he gripped his rifle, and how small tremors occasionally ran through his frame. "Papa," Charlotte whispered to her father, her voice filled with the earnest concern that only children can express so purely. "That guard is really, really hurt. Shouldn't someone help him?" The Prince of Wales knelt down beside his daughter, his own military experience helping him appreciate the complexity of the situation. "He is hurt, sweetheart," he acknowledged quietly. "But he's also chosen to continue his duty. Sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is keep going when everything tells them to stop." Prince George, standing nearby, was absorbing a lesson about leadership and responsibility that no classroom could have provided. "Is that what being a soldier means?" he asked his father. "Doing your job, even when it's really hard." "Part of it, yes," his father replied thoughtfully. But it's not just soldiers. Anyone who takes responsibility seriously sometimes has to push through difficult moments. That guardsman is showing us what real commitment looks like. The Princess of Wales watched her children's reactions with a mixture of pride and concern. This unplanned encounter was teaching them valuable lessons about duty, courage, and empathy, but she could see how much Charlotte's tender heart was affected by witnessing someone in distress. "Mama," Charlotte said softly, "can we do something to help him? It doesn't seem fair that he has to hurt like that." Her mother's heart swelled with pride at her daughter's compassionate instinct. "Sometimes, darling, the best way to help someone is to witness their courage and remember it. That guardsman is doing something very important, and maybe the most helpful thing we can do is make sure his dedication isn't forgotten." As the crowd continued to swell in anticipation of the ceremony, more people began to notice what the royal family had observed. Social media posts were multiplying, with observers sharing images and videos of James with captions expressing admiration and concern. Hashtags like #DedicatedGuard and #RoyalCourage began trending as people around the world became aware of the drama unfolding at Buckingham Palace. "This guard at Buckingham Palace is clearly struggling but refusing to leave his post," read one viral tweet. "This is what real dedication looks like." Another post, shared thousands of times within minutes, showed a series of photos documenting James's deteriorating condition over the course of his posting. "You can see him getting weaker, but he's not giving up. Incredible display of duty and honor." James remained unaware of his growing internet fame. His entire world focused on the immediate challenge of remaining upright for 30 more minutes. He had begun using meditation techniques taught during his training, trying to separate his consciousness from the physical pain radiating through his body. But the injury was winning the battle against his willpower, and he was beginning to fear that he might not be able to complete his posting. The changing of the guard ceremony was a precisely choreographed affair, involving multiple regiments and dozens of soldiers moving in perfect synchronization. James knew that his relief was approaching with the new guard detail, but he also knew that any sign of weakness during the ceremony would be captured by hundreds of cameras and potentially embarrass not just himself, but the entire regiment. Sergeant Major Thompson appeared again, making another inspection round as the ceremony approached. His experienced eye immediately noted the deterioration in James's condition. The young guardsman's face had gone pale, his jaw was clenched with obvious strain, and his entire body was trembling with the effort of remaining upright. "Mitchell," Thompson said quietly, positioning himself between James and the crowd to provide some privacy, "you need medical attention. I'm relieving you now." "Please, Sergeant Major," James replied through gritted teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let me finish. Just 30 more minutes. I can do it." Thompson studied the young soldier with a mixture of admiration and concern. He had seen many displays of courage during his 20 years of service, but James's determination to complete his posting despite obvious injury was remarkable even by the high standards of the Guards regiments. "Son, you've already proven your dedication," Thompson said gently. "No one could question your courage or commitment. But I won't risk serious injury for the sake of ceremony." "With respect, Sergeant Major," James replied, his voice gaining strength despite his physical weakness. "This isn't just about ceremony. Every person watching, especially the children, sees in us a symbol of something larger. I won't let them down. I won't let the regiment down. I can make it to noon." Thompson was silent for a long moment, weighing the competing demands of soldier welfare and military tradition. He could see the growing crowd's fascination with James's struggle, could sense that this had become more than just a routine guard posting. Finally, he made a decision that would be discussed in military circles for years to come. "I'll give you 15 more minutes," Thompson said quietly. "But if you show any sign of collapse, I'm pulling you immediately. And after this posting, you go straight to the medical officer. Non-negotiable." "Thank you, Sergeant Major," James replied, relief flooding through him despite the continued pain. As Thompson moved away, James felt a renewed surge of determination. 15 minutes seemed achievable, even with his injury. He focused on breathing techniques, on the pride of his regiment, on the trust placed in him by his superiors and his country. He thought about the little boy from Yorkshire who had dreamed of wearing this uniform, and about all the guardsmen who had stood this same post throughout history. The royal children had watched this latest interaction with intense interest, sensing that something important was happening even if they couldn't hear the specific conversation. "He's staying," Charlotte observed with a mixture of worry and admiration. Even though he's hurt so badly. That's what heroes do, Prince George said quietly, his young mind processing lessons about leadership and sacrifice that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Princess of Wales felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched this extraordinary display of dedication. Here was a young man, probably not much older than some of her staff members, demonstrating the kind of commitment to duty that exemplified the best of British military tradition. "Children," she said softly, "I want you to remember this moment. Remember how that brave soldier chose to honor his commitment even when it was difficult. That's the kind of character we should all strive to develop." As the ceremony preparations reached their final phase, James summoned reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. The pain was now constant and overwhelming, but he found that by focusing on the honor of his position and the trust placed in him, he could push through barriers he had thought impossible to cross. The crowd had grown to over 1,000 people, many of them now specifically there to witness James's completion of his posting. Word had spread through social media and among the tour groups that something special was happening at post number 7, and people were traveling from across London to see this display of dedication firsthand. News crews had begun to arrive as well, having picked up on the social media buzz surrounding James's struggle. Reporters were setting up positions where they could capture the conclusion of what was already being called one of the most remarkable displays of military dedication in recent memory. As the palace clock prepared to strike 11:15, James Mitchell stood at his post, battered but unbroken, ready to face the final phase of a posting that had transformed from routine duty into legendary perseverance. The next 15 minutes would test everything he had learned about courage, commitment, and the true meaning of service to crown and country. The final 15 minutes of James Mitchell's posting began with the quarter-hour chime of the palace clock, each bronze note reverberating through the courtyard like a countdown to either triumph or collapse. James felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice, every fiber of his being focused on maintaining his position for just a little longer. The pain in his ankle had reached a level that seemed to transcend physical sensation, becoming something that consumed his entire awareness. The crowd surrounding the palace had swelled to unprecedented proportions. Word of the injured guardsman's determination had spread far beyond social media, picked up by news outlets, and transmitted across the globe. Television news crews from multiple networks had positioned themselves to capture what many were already calling one of the most remarkable displays of military dedication in modern history. James was now standing almost entirely on his right leg, using every technique he had learned about balance and posture to conceal this fact from the watching crowds. His left ankle, he was certain, was either severely sprained or fractured, but the alternative to continuing, the thought of abandoning his post mere minutes before completion, was unthinkable. Every breath required conscious effort. Every second demanded a renewal of his commitment to duty over comfort. Princess Charlotte had not taken her eyes off James for the past hour, her young heart completely invested in his struggle. She could see things that the adults around her were missing. The way his left foot was barely touching the ground, the manner in which his hands trembled despite their firm grip on his rifle, the slight sway that indicated he was fighting to remain upright. "Mama," Charlotte whispered urgently, tugging on her mother's sleeve with the persistence that only an 8-year-old could maintain. "I think he might fall down. He's really trying, but I think he might fall down." The Princess of Wales followed her daughter's gaze, her own eyes now trained to see the subtle signs of distress that Charlotte's natural empathy had detected. What she saw filled her with a complex mixture of admiration and concern. This young soldier was demonstrating the kind of dedication to duty that defined the best of British military tradition, but he was clearly pushing himself beyond reasonable physical limits. Prince George, meanwhile, had been observing the growing crowd's reaction to James's struggle. At 10 years old, he was already developing an understanding of how individual actions could capture public imagination and convey larger meanings about character and values. "Papa," George said thoughtfully, "lots of people are watching him now. I think they're all hoping he can finish." The Prince of Wales nodded, recognizing the truth in his son's observation. What had begun as a routine ceremonial posting had evolved into something much larger, a public demonstration of the values that underpinned British military service. James had become, without seeking it, a symbol of commitment that was inspiring people around the world. Sometimes, the prince explained to his children, one person's courage can remind everyone else what's truly important. That guardsman isn't just doing his job anymore. He's showing all of us what real dedication looks like. As the ceremony preparations entered their final phase, Sergeant Major Thompson found himself in an unprecedented situation. He had given James permission to continue, but the young guardsman's condition was clearly deteriorating. Military protocol demanded that he prioritize soldier welfare, but he also understood that James was creating something meaningful that extended beyond simple duty compliance. Thompson positioned himself where he could reach James quickly if needed, while also trying to respect the guardsman's determination to complete his posting. He had called ahead to ensure that medical personnel were standing by, and he had backup guards ready to step in if James showed any sign of imminent collapse. "Steady, lad," Thompson murmured, just loud enough for James to hear. "The whole world is watching, and they're all rooting for you." James heard the sergeant major's words and felt a surge of determination that cut through the fog of pain surrounding him. The knowledge that his struggle had captured public attention was both humbling and motivating. He wasn't just representing himself or even his regiment anymore. He had become a symbol of perseverance that people around the world were following. Social media activity around James's situation had reached extraordinary levels. The hashtag Guardian Courage was trending globally, with millions of people sharing images, videos, and messages of support. News anchors were providing live updates on his condition, and betting pools had even emerged regarding whether he would complete his full posting. Breaking: British Royal Guard continues posting despite obvious injury, read one news alert that was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Extraordinary display of military dedication captured on live television. International media outlets had picked up the story, with correspondents providing commentary on what James's actions represented about British military values and tradition. The BBC had interrupted regular programming to provide live coverage of the final minutes of his posting, with military experts analyzing the significance of his determination. In the crowd immediately surrounding James's post, a remarkable transformation had taken place. What had begun as typical tourist chatter had given way to an almost reverential quiet, as hundreds of people found themselves genuinely invested in this young soldier's struggle. Children who had been restless and playful were now standing silently, somehow understanding that they were witnessing something important. An elderly veteran, wearing his regimental badge on his coat lapel, had tears streaming down his face as he watched James's display of dedication. "That's what we were all trained to do," he said quietly to his grandson. "But few of us ever had to prove it like that young man is doing." As the minutes ticked by, James's condition became increasingly precarious. His vision had begun to blur slightly from the combination of pain and exhaustion, and he could feel his balance becoming more unstable with each passing moment. But the end was so close now, just a few more minutes until his relief would arrive, and he could finally abandon the rigid posture he had maintained for nearly 2 hours. The changing of the guard ceremony was proceeding with its usual precision, but even the incoming guards had been made aware of the situation at post number 7. The soldier designated to relieve James had been briefed on the extraordinary circumstances and was prepared to provide immediate support if needed. Princess Charlotte suddenly grabbed her mother's hand tightly. "Mama, look at his face," she said with the clarity of observation that children possess. "He's getting really pale. I think he needs help right now." The Princess of Wales looked at James's face and saw what her daughter had noticed. The young guardsman's complexion had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of someone fighting against physical collapse. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face were visibly strained, and small beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cool air. "Should we do something?" she asked her husband quietly, her maternal instincts warring with her understanding of military protocol. The Prince of Wales was facing a dilemma that few people could understand. As someone with military experience, he appreciated James's dedication, but also recognized the signs of someone pushing beyond safe physical limits. As a member of the royal family, he understood that any intervention on his part would create its own complications. "He's so close to finishing," George observed, checking his watch with the precision that had been drilled into him from an early age. "Just 5 more minutes." Those 5 minutes stretched ahead of James like an eternity. Each second required a conscious decision to continue. Each breath was an act of will over weakness. He found himself drawing on memories of his training, on the pride of his family when he had earned his place in the Guards, on the honor of wearing a uniform that connected him to centuries of British military tradition. The pain in his ankle had become something beyond normal sensation, reaching levels that made him wonder if he was causing permanent damage. But the alternative, surrendering his post with mere minutes remaining, was inconceivable. He thought about his father, working long hours in the garage to support his family, never complaining despite his own aches and pains. He thought about his mother, standing in front of her classroom day after day, giving her best effort regardless of how she felt. As the palace clock prepared to chime 11:30, marking the final phase of James's extraordinary ordeal, the entire scene had taken on an almost surreal quality. Hundreds of people stood in near silence, collectively willing this young soldier to complete his mission. Television cameras captured every moment for audiences around the world, while social media continued to explode with messages of support and admiration. James Mitchell, a 24-year-old from Yorkshire who had dreamed of wearing the Queen's Guard uniform since childhood, was about to discover whether dreams were strong enough to overcome the limits of human endurance. The next few minutes would determine not just whether he completed his posting, but whether his story would become a legend that inspired future generations of soldiers and civilians alike. The final minutes of James Mitchell's posting unfolded with the intensity of a dramatic crescendo, each second weighted with significance that extended far beyond the palace walls. As the clock approached 11:30, James found himself drawing on reserves of strength he never knew existed, his entire being focused on one simple goal: standing until his relief arrived. The pain in his ankle had transcended physical sensation, becoming something that seemed to consume his entire nervous system. His vision had begun to tunnel slightly, and he could feel cold sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill. Every muscle in his body was screaming for relief, but his mind remained locked on the single objective that had sustained him for the past 3 hours: completing his duty. Princess Charlotte had become James's most devoted champion, her 8-year-old heart completely invested in his struggle. She stood pressed against the palace railings, her small hands gripping the iron bars as she watched every micro-movement of the guardsmen who had captured her imagination and respect. "He's still standing," she whispered to her mother, her voice filled with awe and concern. "Even though he's hurting so much, he's still standing." The Princess of Wales felt her own eyes filling with tears as she watched this extraordinary display of determination. As a mother, her instinct was to help someone clearly in distress, but as someone who understood duty and service, she recognized that James's struggle represented something profoundly important about character and commitment. Prince George had been timing James's ordeal with the precision that would one day make him an effective leader. 2 more minutes, he announced quietly to his family. Just 2 more minutes, and he'll have done it. The crowd surrounding the palace had grown to nearly 2,000 people, many of whom had traveled from across London after hearing about the injured guardsman's determination. The atmosphere was unlike anything typically seen during the changing of the guard ceremony. There was a palpable tension in the air as hundreds of people collectively willed James to complete his posting. News crews from around the world were providing live coverage of these final moments, with commentators struggling to find words adequate to describe what they were witnessing. Social media had exploded with messages of support, with #GuardianCourage trending globally as people from every continent shared their admiration for this young soldier's dedication. Sergeant Major Thompson had positioned himself as close as protocol allowed, ready to intervene instantly if James showed any sign of imminent collapse. He had seen many displays of courage during his 20-year career, but James's determination to complete his posting despite obvious injury was remarkable even by the extraordinary standards of the Guards regiments. "Come on, lad," Thompson murmured, just loud enough for James to hear. "You're almost there. The whole world is watching, and they're all proud of you." As the palace clock began its approach to the half-hour chime, James felt his body beginning to rebel against his iron will. His left leg was now bearing virtually no weight, and maintaining his balance required constant micro-adjustments that were becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. His grip on his rifle had become desperate, using the weapon as much for physical support as for ceremonial purpose. But something extraordinary was happening in James's mind. As his physical condition deteriorated, his mental clarity seemed to sharpen. He found himself thinking not about the pain or exhaustion, but about the meaning of the moment he was creating. Every person watching, the children pressed against the railings, the tourists recording on their phones, the news crews broadcasting around the world, was witnessing a demonstration of what human beings could accomplish when they refused to surrender their commitments. The changing of the guard ceremony was proceeding with its usual precision, but every participant was aware that something unprecedented was unfolding at post number 7. The incoming guard detail had been briefed on the situation, and James's relief, Guardsman Davies, was prepared to provide immediate support when he took over the position. 30 seconds, Prince George announced quietly, his young voice filled with anticipation and nervous energy. Those 30 seconds seemed to stretch into infinity for James. Each heartbeat was a conscious choice to continue, each breath an act of defiance against his body's demands for relief. He thought about his childhood dreams of wearing this uniform, about the pride in his parents' eyes when he had earned his place in the Guards, about all the Guardsmen throughout history who had faced their own moments of testing. The palace clock began its chime sequence, each bronze note ringing across the courtyard like a fanfare of triumph. 1, 2, 3. With each chime, James felt a surge of determination that carried him through another few seconds of endurance. Princess Charlotte was counting along with the clock, her small voice barely audible as she whispered, 4, 5, 6. Her entire being was focused on willing James to remain standing for just a few more seconds. 7, 8, 9. The chimes continued, and James could hear them as both a countdown to victory and a celebration of what he was about to accomplish. 10, 11, 12. As the final chime faded into silence, marking exactly 11:30, a cheer began to rise from the crowd. James had done it. He had completed his full posting despite his injury, creating a moment of triumph that would be remembered and retold for generations. But James's ordeal wasn't quite over. Military protocol required him to remain at attention until his relief formally took over the position. Guardsman Davies approached with measured steps, his own sense of the moment's significance evident in his perfect military bearing. Post number 7, requesting relief. Davies announced with crisp military precision. Post number 7, relief acknowledged, James replied, his voice steady despite the tremendous effort required to maintain his composure for these final moments. The formal exchange of duties proceeded with ceremonial perfection, but everyone present understood they were witnessing the conclusion of something extraordinary. As Davies officially took over the position, James was finally free to step down from his post. The moment James took his first step away from post number 7, his carefully maintained composure finally gave way. His injured ankle buckled beneath him, and he would have fallen if not for Sergeant Major Thompson, who had positioned himself to provide immediate support. "I've got you, son," Thompson said quietly, his voice filled with pride and concern. "You did it. You bloody well did it." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause as they realized what they had witnessed. This wasn't just the end of a ceremonial guard posting. It was the conclusion of one of the most remarkable displays of dedication and perseverance in recent memory. People were cheering, crying, and sharing the moment with strangers as they celebrated James's extraordinary achievement. Princess Charlotte was among the most emotional observers, tears streaming down her face as she clapped with enthusiasm that came from her heart. "He did it, Mama," she exclaimed through her tears. "He was so hurt, but he did it." The Princess of Wales knelt down to embrace her daughter, equally moved by what they had witnessed. "Yes, darling, he did. And do you know why? Because he understood that sometimes keeping our promises is more important than our comfort." Prince George stood quietly, absorbing lessons about leadership, duty, and character that no textbook could have taught. At 10 years old, he had witnessed a demonstration of the kind of commitment that would be expected of him throughout his life, and the memory would stay with him forever. As medical personnel arrived to attend to James, he insisted on walking to the medical station under his own power, supported but not carried. Even in his moment of physical collapse, he maintained the dignity and bearing that had characterized his entire ordeal. The Prince of Wales made a decision that would surprise even his own security detail. He approached Sergeant Major Thompson and requested permission to briefly speak with James before he received medical treatment. "Your Royal Highness," Thompson replied with obvious surprise, "it would be an honor." As the royal family approached, James attempted to stand at attention despite his injury and exhaustion. The Prince of Wales immediately gestured for him to remain seated, understanding that this was not a moment for strict protocol. "Guardsman Mitchell," the prince said quietly, his voice filled with genuine respect, "my children, and I have been watching your remarkable display of dedication this morning. What you've accomplished here represents the very best of British military tradition." James struggled to find words adequate to respond to such unprecedented recognition. "Your Royal Highness, I was simply doing my duty." "No," Princess Charlotte interjected with the honesty that only children possess. "You were doing much more than that. You were being brave when it was really, really hard to be brave. The Princess of Wales stepped forward, equally moved by what they had witnessed. Guardsman Mitchell, you've given my children a lesson about commitment and perseverance that they'll carry with them for the rest of their lives. Thank you for that gift. Prince George, speaking with the formality that had been instilled in him, but with genuine emotion, added, when I have to do difficult things, I'll remember how you didn't give up even when you were hurt. As medical personnel finally insisted that James receive immediate treatment for his ankle, the full scope of his achievement began to become clear. News reports were already calling it one of the most remarkable displays of military dedication in modern history. Social media was flooded with messages of admiration from around the world, and military leaders from multiple countries had issued statements praising James's extraordinary commitment to duty. The investigation would later reveal that James had been standing on a fractured ankle for nearly 3 hours, an achievement that military medical experts declared was almost impossible from a purely physical standpoint. His determination had literally overcome what should have been insurmountable physiological limitations. In the weeks that followed, James's story would inspire countless others facing their own moments of testing. Students struggling with difficult exams, athletes pushing through injury, workers dealing with challenging circumstances, all would find strength in the memory of the young guardsman who refused to abandon his post. The royal children would carry the lessons of that morning throughout their lives. Princess Charlotte would grow up with an unshakable understanding of what true courage looked like, while Prince George would develop a leadership style characterized by the same kind of quiet determination he had witnessed that day. As for James Mitchell himself, he would recover fully from his injury and continue his service in the Guards, but he would forever be known as the guardsman who stood when standing seemed impossible, who chose duty over comfort, and who reminded the world that some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost. The morning that began as routine ceremonial duty had become legend, creating a story that would be told in military academies, shared in leadership seminars, and passed down through generations as an example of what human beings can accomplish when they refuse to surrender their commitments. James Mitchell had achieved something far greater than completing a guard posting. He had created a moment of inspiration that would echo through time, reminding all who heard his story that true strength comes not from the absence of struggle, but from the decision to continue despite it.